Today we're going to talk a little bit about how we can unite both the left and the right wing here in the United States. But before we can talk about how we do that, we first need to talk about where the disunity is coming from in the first place. So I, for one, like to watch Ben Shapiro. I like to watch the Young Turks. Tuning in to this robust political dialogue makes me feel like I'm woke, like I'm smarter than everybody else, like I'm better than everybody else. So where does this need to feel better than everybody else come from? Right? Well, I can tell you for myself, which is that my parents and my teachers always used to tell me that I was a smart kid. So I use the political dialogue as my weapon in extracting this validation in my day-to-day life. Also, I have other shortcomings that I need to compensate for. So I don't make enough money, maybe I'm not that great of a friend, and I please myself to the thought of somebody I definitely shouldn't be. So once you realize that these are just personal insecurities, and they have really no bearing on whether or not you're a good person, whether or not you're a net value add to society, right? You're not strangling homeless people. You're not putting kittens in a blender. You're a good person, right? So once you internalize that, you'll begin to see that your interest in politics just fades away. And so once we figure out our insecurities, once we talk through them with a therapist, pause the video, come back once that's done, and we can talk about how we're going to reframe the most divisive political issues that we see today. Let's start by talking one of the issues which I believe to be the least controversial to solve, which is school shootings, because nobody is aroused by the thought of dead kids, nor should they be aroused by the thought of living kids, but we're just going to focus on the little kids right now and how we're going to unite everybody. Before we start iterating over solutions to these problems, I have to start by saying that I'm going to use the word Marxist to refer to somebody on the left. I'm going to use the word Nazi to refer to somebody on the right. This I believe to be the most inclusive terminology, which is the most easily understood by the opposing side. So the Nazi argument, the Nazi truism in this case would be that you need a good guy with a gun, a cop, to stop a bad guy with a gun. And in addition to these arguments, these truisms, I'm also going to be providing translations as well. So with a lot of these translations, you may notice that they're easier, more concise, easier to express. And also with some of the translations, just based on the sound, you'll notice from that particular perspective the problematic areas with that solution. So the translation for this would be, you need a bastard pig with an assault rifle to stop an armed and troubled kid. So with that perspective, right, the solution there seems pretty obvious in that we should just take away all of the guns from that situation. But the thing is, that's kind of difficult, right, because there are a lot of guns to start with, right, they're easy to hide, and you have these damn Nazis who seem to think that their little piece of paper entitles them to own a gun. Entitles them to own a firearm, right? Translated, Second Amendment of the United States, blah, blah, blah. So we can't really take away all of the guns. We have to try another solution. So let's try, for example, we could try requiring background checks. We can try requiring that people take a class on how to properly secure their firearms so that the small children don't get their little hands on these destructive machines. So what happens then, right? We have the George Floyd problem, right? Unarmed African-American kid gets murdered by pigs because of unfortunate circumstances, or otherwise translated, convicted felon dies resisting arrest. So the convicted felon part is important here because the solution we're trying right now, right, requiring background checks for somebody to purchase a firearm, is reflective of the current legislation today. And I think we can all agree that had George Floyd been armed, the situation surrounding his death would have ended a lot differently and hopefully a lot more fairly. So let's talk a little bit about the circumstances, right, because those are important too. Well, George Floyd, during his early youth, was involved in some pharmaceutical street entrepreneurship, and at the time did not have the proper licensure to be doing that, which was frowned upon. Also, he wandered into somebody's house and attempted to relocate some of the furnishings to outside the house, and was actually exercising his Second Amendment right during this time. And he was doing all this while black, mind you. The pigment darkening his skin, also darkening the perspective, the lenses through which the jury saw George Floyd. At which point he was later, labeled a convicted felon. So I think we can all agree, right, Nazis and Marxists alike, that there are corrupt agents in our government trying to strip black people of their firearms. So we can't really take away the firearms based on felony status. Now, what about requiring people to take a class to secure their firearms properly? Well, you run into the voter ID problem, right? There's a racial disparity in literacy, and the racial disparity there would imply a racial disparity in gun ownership. And what happens when one race of people owns more firearms than another? Slavery 2.0. So we can't really address this issue through gun control. We have to find another common factor among all of these school shootings. So one of the themes which I've noticed with a lot of these school shootings is that it's often a male student and a female teacher. So it's essentially a misogyny issue. So one of the solutions which I was thinking of is that we could gender segregate the schools again with male teachers for male students and girl teachers for girl students. And then in that case, there's something about having a positive masculine role model for these young boys, or if we were to translate that, the toxic masculinity cancels itself out. And I know a lot of this is going to sound like parody, but I'm doing the best I can, and this is a really difficult undertaking. So if you have a problem with it, you can just give it your best shot yourself, and we'll see how you perform. But in the name of this gender segregation, it brings me to the next topic, which is sexual preferences and transgenders. So there's a lot of shame that goes around with our sexual preferences, especially stigmas coming from the opposite side. But, if you're not the kind of person who's ashamed of your sexual preferences, or if you've never felt attraction for the same sex, or maybe a blood relative, then you're either lying or a saint, in which case, it's pretty lonely at the top, and you're not going to be forming any impactful political parties on your saint high horse, okay? So there's not much we can do here except compromise, because there's going to be the sense of disgust from the opposite side, and I don't think there's much we can do about that. But let's say I'm a Nazi, for example. This is an example of how I might compromise with my Marxist counterparts. So I would say, you can do your male-on-male thing. I'm not going to describe how that's done while I can do my sister. Or you can transition your little girl if I can uphold the covenant of Abraham, circumcision, my little boy. Again, there's really not much we can do here except compromise. And once we accept that, some people have unorthodox preferences, immoral or distasteful preferences, we can start to unravel the ideological post facto justifications surrounding the very real human emotions in many of these cases in the name of unity. So one case wherein somebody is affected by somebody else's sexual preferences is a parent, let's say a Nazi parent with a gay son, right? And the Nazi parent might say something like, I'm frustrated, I'm angry, I'm upset because my son has fallen to the temptation of Lucifer in the form of an attractive man in this case. And so if we were to unwrap the ideological language, we would comprehend something more like, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, upset, I'm not going to have grandchildren, right? I'm not going to be able to take my grandchildren to school or read to them at night or spoil them. So there are very human emotions at the core of the ideological language that make these Christian conservatives in this case, Christian Nazis in this case, very much worthy of sympathy in the name of unity in this case. So let's talk a little bit about abortions. So given that a national abortion ban is so difficult to pull off, right, you don't really need a mainstream, easy to legislate medical intervention to abort your kid, right? And I'm going to use the word kid. I would normally use the word fetus, but I don't really know what that means. I'm not going to use baby because that's a little too intimate. Kid is a fair middle ground. Given that it's so difficult to enforce and it's so easy to pull off by alternative means, right? You've got fasting, which is really trendy right now. They're easy to acquire medical compounds that can achieve essentially the same result. You can also take feminine hygiene to the next level with like a metal hanger sort of apparatus, old school. But given that it's really difficult to enforce, we don't necessarily need to escalate this sort of issue to the national stage. We can keep it confined to the individual issue that it is, keeping it confined to the individuals whom it affects. So before we talk about who it might affect, right, why might a woman want an abortion? Well, maybe number one, she can do better. Maybe the man she's dealing with is not quite as stable, in which case she can essentially do better. Or maybe she's concerned about what her friends or family might think about the man whom she's chosen. In other words, she can pretty much always do better. That's the primary reason why a woman would want an abortion, and chances are that is usually the case. So the people being affected by this sort of thing might be, again, parents wanting grandchildren, or the man who may have impregnated the woman wanting to lock down that woman. So in the case of the parents wanting grandchildren, maybe your daughter's not exercising her best judgment. Maybe the man she's messing with now is probably her best bet, but doubting your daughter's ability to carry the torch is really no different from doubting the flammability of the torch itself, right? Like times are different, right? She's seen different stimulus, a different set of men. So I would just trust her judgment in that regard. If her judgment is not really something that you trust, you better start having more kids if you haven't already. But I mean, worst case, you'll just have to take the law into your own hands. There's really nothing more you can do about that. Same with if you're a man trying to lock down a woman, right? She probably thinks she can do better. That just really sucks, and I'm sorry about that. Non-violently, of course, you'll have to take the law into your own hands, because no government body is going to be able to legislate this sort of thing with any effectiveness. So healthcare really isn't that big of a deal, okay? I could walk into an emergency room with a gunshot wound, with a stab wound, with a busted open appendix, and the doctors would be obligated to, not only personally, but also legally obligated to treat me until I were stabilized. I wouldn't have to show proof of insurance. I wouldn't have to show my ID. I could just be stabilized, be treated, and then walk out and not look back. So there's really no debate here. Emergency healthcare is essentially free. Now, let's talk about wealth inequality. I also get really jealous of rich people, but the thing is, they can pay politicians to keep themselves rich and to keep everybody else in the same position. So if I wanted to change that, I'd have to get rich myself and buy my own politician, at which point I really wouldn't give a shit about wealth inequality or anything like that. Now let's talk about race and the border policy. But first things first, I got to get one thing out of the way, right? Nazis, I know you want more white people in this country, okay? And I was having this discussion actually with a 10-year-old kid, right? We started talking about Minecraft, but then I realized he was ahead of his time. So I'm going to throw a wrench in your position, which is that Irish people, technically white, right? Italians, Greeks, technically white, but are those the kinds of people you want in your country? Is that a question you want to answer to? I didn't think so. So that's not really a rational border policy. So aside from that, what sorts of reasons would you want a border policy in the first place? Well, one might be a drug problem. Maybe, the Chinese and the Mexicans, they've teamed up essentially and they've figured out how to manufacture a lot of the Zoomer grade, let's say Snapchat exclusive type drugs, and that's causing a pretty big problem. Number two is that maybe you're a truck driver and you got your job taken by a Mexican who can do the job a lot more efficiently at half the price. And then number three is that maybe you grew up in a white neighborhood and now it's mostly brown skins and darker skins. So how do we solve the drug problem? Well, they've got these potent, right, as I was saying, the Zoomer grade drugs, right? You fill up a grocery cart full of them and you can take out a city like New York. So in my mind, it seems impossible to sort of defend all of the coastline and all of the border of the United States without some sort of like Obama-like genius to figure out how to enforce that sort of thing. But number two, let's say you get your job taken by a Mexican. The alternative in that case is to force companies to hire white truckers, and but the issue with that is you're just passing those cost of the white truckers onto the white consumer. So it's fundamentally no different from welfare. So, and I know this, it kind of sucks, it makes you feel maybe not so good about yourself, but, take some time off, go on welfare and figure your life out. And, maybe you can come back with some actually profitable skills and let the Mexican take your job, and then you can take some time off to learn some more skills. And so number 3 is maybe you grew up in a white neighborhood, but now it's not a white neighborhood anymore, which I think that's just an inflation thing. Like maybe you just got priced out of the white neighborhood. So I think, you got to solve the inflation problem first, and then you can solve the darker complexion of your neighborhood. So, I mean, lots of these issues, right? You'll notice that this is the theme, is that you can psychologize and offer sympathy at the same time to find unity with your fellow man, no matter how many topics you disagree with him on. Take some time, take some effort, and a lot of focus and attention. But it's doable. It's something we can all achieve, and we can all have a political party that represents our interests on a global stage.